I looked down at the envelope in my hands for what felt like the 100th time that afternoon. The gold seal on the back had already begun to peel because my fingers would not stop rubbing against it. Across the room, my mother-in-law stood with her arms folded, smiling in the satisfied way she always did whenever she believed she had finally proven that she was right about me. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 38 years old. And the woman staring at me with that victorious smile had spent the last 15 years convincing everyone I was the worst mistake her son had ever made. She took one slow step toward me. "Well," she asked loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear, "are you finally leaving, or are you planning to take something else that doesn't belong to you?" My husband lowered his eyes instead of looking at me. His silence hurt more than her words ever could. I picked up the small cardboard box that held everything I was allowed to take from the house after 15 years of marriage. A few photo albums, 3 sweaters, my grandmother's necklace, some notebooks. Everything else, she insisted, belonged to her son. I walked toward the front door. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked if I had somewhere to go. Nobody wondered how 15 years of marriage could fit into one cardboard box. As my hand reached the doorknob, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. A man in a dark grey suit stepped out holding another envelope. He looked around the room before asking one question that made every conversation stop. "Which one of you is Claire Bennett?" But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Before we go any further, drop your first name and your city in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. And if stories about quiet justice and unexpected recognition are your kind of stories, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. 15 years earlier, I believed marrying Daniel Bennett would be the easiest decision of my life. I was 23. He was 26. We met inside a small public library, where I worked 30 hours each week, while finishing my master's degree in archival studies. Daniel came every Tuesday evening after work to borrow history books he rarely had enough time to read. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't wealthy. He drove a 12-year-old pickup truck, whose driver's side window only rolled down halfway. His shoes were always polished. His shirts were always ironed. He thanked every cashier. He remembered every employee's name. That was enough for me. People often assume successful marriages begin with grand romantic gestures. Mine began because a quiet man returned his books exactly on time. Our first date cost $28.40. He paid for dinner. I paid for dessert. We laughed because neither of us had enough money to pretend otherwise. When he proposed 18 months later, the engagement ring contained a tiny diamond barely larger than a grain of rice. I cried anyway. Not because of the ring. Because of the promise behind it. Looking back now, I realize I wasn't marrying only Daniel. I was marrying his family. And I understood almost nothing about them. His mother, Evelyn Bennett, was 53 when I first met her. She had spent 30 years believing that sacrifice earned permanent authority. She raised 3 children, while her husband worked 70-hour weeks running a plumbing company. She measured love through loyalty. She measured loyalty through obedience. In her mind, a good daughter-in-law never questioned. Never disagreed. Never built an identity outside the family. When she smiled at me during our first dinner together, it looked genuine. Only years later did I understand it had been an evaluation. She wasn't deciding whether she liked me. She was deciding whether I deserved her son. His father, Robert, was quieter. He rarely interrupted anyone. He solved problems with work instead of conversation. If Evelyn spoke first, Robert usually nodded. Not because he always agreed. Because disagreement required energy he preferred to spend elsewhere. Daniel's younger sister, Melissa, was 21. Confident, funny, always surrounded by friends. She never openly insulted me. Instead, she mastered something much subtler. Tiny comments. "So, you really think working in a library is a career?" I could never sit quietly all day. "You must have so much free time." None of those statements sounded cruel by themselves. Together, over years, they slowly erased confidence. At first, I dismissed them. Families tease each other. That was what I told myself. I wanted peace. Peace has a strange price. Sometimes you pay for it with your voice. Growing up, my own family looked completely different. My father repaired school buses. My mother taught second grade for 34 years. Money was always carefully planned. Every January, my parents sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and listed every expected expense for the year. Nothing happened by accident. If we wanted a vacation, we saved. If something broke, we fixed it ourselves. When I was 12, I wanted a new bicycle. Instead of buying one, my father found an old rusted frame for $15. Every Saturday for 3 months, we restored it together. I learned something that never left me. Things become valuable because of the care invested in them. Not because they were expensive to begin with. That memory would return years later, in a way I never expected. Daniel and I rented a tiny apartment after our wedding. 680 square feet. 1 bedroom. 1 bathroom. A kitchen where opening the refrigerator blocked the oven door. We loved it. The first year wasn't glamorous. I earned $41,000. Daniel earned $46,000. Together we carefully built a life. Every month we saved exactly $600. Sometimes more. Never less. 5 years later, we had enough for a down payment on our own home. Then everything changed. Robert experienced heart problems. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough that managing the family home became difficult. Evelyn suggested something that sounded reasonable. Why don't you two move in for a while, help around the house, save money? Daniel liked the idea. We'll stay a year, he told me. A year, I agreed. 1 year became 15. Looking back, that decision changed every chapter that followed. The Bennett house wasn't small. Nearly 4,000 square feet. 5 bedrooms. Large garden. Finished basement. 2 garages. Plenty of space. But somehow there was never enough room for me. Within the first month, Evelyn had opinions about everything. The laundry. The cooking. The grocery shopping. How towels should be folded. How soup should taste. How often windows should be cleaned. She corrected everything without raising her voice, which somehow hurt more. Oh, Claire doesn't know our family traditions. I'm sure she'll learn. She means well. Those sentences sounded harmless. Until you heard them every day. When guests visited, she told little stories. Claire tried making mashed potatoes once. Everyone laughed. She forgot the butter. The truth. I had forgotten the butter exactly 1 time. 8 years earlier. She repeated that story for the next decade. Another favorite. Claire gets confused balancing finances. Reality. I managed every household bill. Every mortgage payment. Every insurance renewal. Every tax document. Late fees during 15 years. 0. Yet somehow the family believed I couldn't manage money. Because Evelyn repeated it often enough. Repetition has remarkable power. Especially inside families. Daniel didn't notice at first. Or perhaps he didn't want to. Mom doesn't mean anything by it. She's old-fashioned. That's just how she talks. Each explanation cost him nothing. Each one cost me a little more. Meanwhile, my own career quietly grew. I became senior archivist. Then department manager. Eventually director of historical collections at the regional museum. Overseeing nearly 300,000 preserved documents. Managing 12 employees. Annual operating budget of $2.8 million. I never talked much about work during family dinners. Whenever I tried, someone interrupted. Melissa discussed vacations. Evelyn discussed neighbors. Daniel discussed work projects. Eventually, I stopped trying. It became easier. Or so I believed. One evening during our 9th year in the Bennett house, I overheard something while carrying dishes into the kitchen. Evelyn thought I couldn't hear her. Claire only stays because Daniel earns good money. Someone asked quietly, doesn't she work too? Evelyn laughed. Oh please, her little museum job probably pays enough for coffee. I froze. My salary at that point exceeded Daniel's by nearly $20,000. Not once had I hidden it. Not once had anyone asked. They simply accepted Evelyn's version. That night I considered correcting everyone. Instead I stayed silent. Not because I was afraid. Because I believed truth eventually revealed itself. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it waits years. Over the following 6 years, Evelyn slowly convinced Daniel of something far worse. That every disagreement came from my obsession with money. If I suggested saving, see, she only thinks about money. If I declined buying something unnecessary, she's controlling. If I worked late, career comes first. Reality became irrelevant. Only the story mattered. And Evelyn was the storyteller everyone trusted. The strange part is that I don't think she hated me. Hatred is emotional. This was different. She genuinely believed she was protecting her son. In her mind, I represented independence. Change. A future she couldn't control. She wasn't trying to destroy me. She was trying to preserve the family she remembered. Unfortunately, preserving the past often requires rewriting the present. And I became the easiest chapter to rewrite. The first time I realized how completely the story about me had taken root was during Robert's 68th birthday dinner. There were 23 people gathered around the backyard patio: cousins, neighbors, old family friends, and 2 former employees from Robert's plumbing company. The tables were covered with homemade food, and Evelyn moved from guest to guest, making sure everyone had enough to eat. She looked happiest when she was hosting people. It gave her a stage. I had spent almost 2 full days preparing for that dinner. I baked 4 apple pies. I arranged the flowers. I cleaned the guest rooms because relatives from another state were staying overnight. I even repaired one of the patio chairs after noticing a loose leg. Nobody knew I had done those things. Evelyn accepted every compliment with the same smile. Oh, thank you, I try my best. Not once did she mention my name. I told myself it didn't matter. Recognition wasn't why I helped. But being invisible year after year leaves a different kind of wound. Halfway through dinner, one of Robert's cousins asked me about my job. So Claire, what exactly do you do these days? Before I could answer, Evelyn laughed. She still plays with old papers. Several people smiled politely. I smiled too. It's actually a little more complicated than that. Oh, the cousin asked. I supervise a historical preservation department. Before I could explain further, Evelyn interrupted again. It sounds much more impressive than it really is. The conversation immediately shifted toward vacation plans. That was the pattern. Every achievement became smaller before anyone could appreciate it. Over time, people stopped asking. Daniel never noticed. Or perhaps he noticed, but believed it wasn't important. The difficult truth about emotional neglect is that it rarely arrives through dramatic moments. It arrives through thousands of tiny moments. A conversation interrupted. A compliment redirected. An opinion ignored. A joke repeated one time too many. Eventually, those moments become the atmosphere you breathe. Around our 12th year in the Bennett home, I received an award from the State Historical Society for leading one of the largest archival restoration projects in the region. The project lasted 31 months. My team restored more than 48,000 handwritten records that historians believed had been permanently damaged by water. It made local news. The museum organized a small celebration. Daniel attended. He congratulated me. For a few hours I felt seen. That evening we returned home. The framed certificate was still sitting on the dining room table when Evelyn walked in. She glanced at it for less than 5 seconds. So, that was all she said. Then she looked at Daniel. Did you remember to call the insurance company about the garage? The conversation moved on. The certificate stayed on the table until I quietly carried it upstairs. No one ever asked about it again. A week later, Melissa stopped by for coffee. She noticed the certificate hanging in our bedroom. I didn't know they gave awards for filing paperwork. She laughed. I smiled politely. It wasn't for filing paperwork. I'm kidding. But she wasn't. Some jokes are simply opinions wearing disguises. The hardest part wasn't Evelyn. It was watching Daniel slowly begin repeating her language. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. Simply because he heard it every day. When I stayed late at work, he would say, "Mom thinks you're working too hard." When I accepted another leadership role, he said, "Mom worries your career matters more than family." At first those words belonged to Evelyn. Eventually they belonged to him too. One rainy Tuesday evening, I asked him a simple question. "Daniels, do you believe that?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared out the kitchen window. "I don't know." 4 words. They hurt more than any accusation. After 15 years together. He didn't know. That night I barely slept. Not because we argued. We didn't. Silence can be louder than shouting. The next morning I arrived at work early. The museum had just acquired a private collection of letters dating back almost 160 years. The donor was an elderly woman named Margaret Ellis. She had spent decades preserving her family's history. As we carefully unpacked each document, she watched every movement with remarkable attention. Finally, she smiled. "You handle these papers as though they matter." "They do." She nodded. "No," she gently corrected me. "They matter to you." That sentence stayed with me. Because I suddenly realized something. The people who valued my work had nothing to gain from praising me. They simply saw what I actually did. Meanwhile, the people closest to me had spent years looking at me through someone else's opinions. There is an enormous difference between being known and being described. I returned home determined to speak honestly. Not angrily. Honestly. That evening after dinner, I asked Daniel if we could take a walk. We walked 3 blocks without speaking. Finally, I stopped beside a small neighborhood park. "I don't think your family respects me." He sighed before I even finished. "They respect you." "They don't. They just have different personalities." "No." I looked directly at him. "They believe I'm selfish." He stayed quiet. "They believe I only care about money." Still silence. "They believe I contribute almost nothing." He rubbed his forehead. "You worry too much about what people think." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was so far from the truth. I've spent 15 years trying not to care. He looked tired. "So what do you want me to do?" It was a fair question. "I want you to tell me whether you believe them." Another long silence. Finally he answered. "I think maybe there's some truth somewhere in the middle." Some truth. 3 words destroyed 15 years of trust. Not instantly. Slowly. Quietly. Like water finding a crack in stone. From that point onward, something inside our marriage changed. We remained polite. We still shared meals. We celebrated birthdays. We attended weddings. From the outside, nothing looked different. Inside, everything was. A few months later, Robert's health declined enough that he required regular appointments. Without being asked, I reorganized my work schedule. Every Wednesday afternoon, I drove him to the cardiologist. Every second Friday, I picked up his prescriptions. I created spreadsheets to track medications. I coordinated appointments with specialists. Robert noticed. He thanked me every single time. Evelyn never did. Instead, she told relatives that Daniel had taken over caring for his father. Daniel corrected her once. Only once. After that, he remained silent. Silence became everyone's favorite language. The final year before everything collapsed felt strangely calm. Almost peaceful. Looking back, I think every family reaches a point where tension becomes so familiar that people mistake it for normal life. Then one small event exposes everything. Ours began with something as ordinary as a bank statement. One Saturday morning, Evelyn walked into the kitchen carrying several unopened envelopes. I sorted today's mail. She handed Daniel a utility bill. She handed Robert an insurance notice. Then she held one envelope in her hand a little longer. This came for Claire. She looked at the return address. A law office. She raised an eyebrow. What does a lawyer want with you? I reached for it. I'll read it later. Instead of giving it to me, she turned the envelope over. Daniel looked curious. Melissa, who had stopped by unexpectedly, leaned closer. What is it? I said I'll read it later. Finally, Evelyn handed it over. Her smile had already changed. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was suspicion. That evening, she asked Daniel about it. I overheard them through the hallway. Did she tell you what the lawyer wanted? No. Doesn't that bother you? I'm sure it's nothing. You trust too easily. I walked into the room. It concerns a former museum donor. Evelyn folded her arms. What kind of legal matter? Confidential. Her expression hardened. Confidential from your husband. It isn't my information to share. That answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it became the beginning of something much worse. Over the next 2 weeks, Evelyn quietly built another story. Maybe Claire was hiding debt. Maybe she was being sued. Maybe she planned to leave Daniel. Maybe she'd been lying about money all along. None of it was true. But none of it needed to be. Rumors grow fastest when they explain what people already want to believe. And after 15 years, they were ready to believe almost anything about me. The truth behind the letter was almost painfully ordinary. 3 years earlier, while overseeing the restoration of a private collection, I had worked closely with an elderly widow named Elena Whitmore. She was 79 when we met, and had spent most of her life protecting hundreds of journals, photographs, and handwritten letters that documented her family's history. She had no children, no brothers, no sisters. The museum assigned me to help organize the collection because it required nearly 18 months of careful preservation. Over that time, we spoke almost every week. Not just about history, about life, about loneliness, about the strange feeling of watching your generation slowly disappear. 2. The morning after I left the Bennett house, I woke up in the spare bedroom of my parents' home. The room hadn't changed much since college. The wallpaper was older. The furniture had a few more scratches. But it still felt safe. My mother knocked gently before entering with a cup of coffee. She didn't ask what had happened. She already knew enough from the tears in my eyes the night before. She simply placed the mug on the bedside table. You can stay as long as you need. Those 8 words carried more comfort than every apology I would later receive. For the first few days, my phone barely stopped vibrating. Most of the calls came from Daniel. I couldn't answer. Not because I hated him. Because I still loved him. And love mixed with disappointment creates a kind of pain that words cannot repair overnight. He left voicemail after voicemail. Claire, please call me. I didn't understand. We need to talk. I made a mistake. Each message sounded more desperate than the last. I listened to everyone. I answered none. Meanwhile, the attorney arranged another meeting. This time it lasted almost 4 hours. He explained every detail of Alina Whitmore's estate. The house on Willow Creek Road wasn't enormous. It was a beautiful 2-story home built nearly 70 years earlier. It had been completely paid off. Its value was estimated at just over $1.8 million. More important than the house itself was the preservation endowment. Alina had established a charitable trust worth nearly $4.6 million. The money was legally restricted. It could only be used to preserve historical documents, support educational programs, and maintain her family's archives. I would never personally own those millions. I would simply oversee how they were used. That mattered to me. Because Alina hadn't rewarded me with wealth. She had entrusted me with responsibility. There is a profound difference. When the meeting ended, Michael Harris looked at me thoughtfully. Mrs. Whitmore spoke about you often. I smiled sadly. I spoke about her too. He nodded. She once told me something interesting. What was that? He opened his notebook. I wrote it down because I thought it was worth remembering. He found the page. Then read quietly. The people who deserve trust are usually the ones who never ask for it. I closed my eyes for a moment. That sounded exactly like Alina. News traveled through the Bennett family much faster than I expected. Within a week, everyone knew. Not just that Alina had trusted me. Not just that she had left me her home. They also learned that several newspapers planned to cover the creation of the Whitmore Historical Foundation. My name appeared in every article. Not because I inherited anything extraordinary. Because I had been chosen to lead the foundation. Recognition changes how people remember the past. Suddenly, relatives who had barely spoken to me for years remembered how hardworking I had always been. Melissa called first. I almost didn't answer. Curiosity won. Hi. There was an awkward silence. Finally she spoke. I owe you an apology. I waited. I shouldn't have believed everything Mom said. Another pause. I shouldn't have repeated it either. Her voice sounded sincere. But sincerity cannot erase history. I appreciate you saying that. Can we meet? Not yet. She quietly accepted my answer. A few days later, Robert came alone to see me. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. We sat on my parents' front porch drinking iced tea. After several minutes, he finally spoke. I failed you. I looked at him. You were always kind to me. I wasn't brave. He corrected himself. I watched things happen. And I stayed quiet. There it was again. Silence. The language that had shaped 15 years. I thought keeping peace was the same as doing the right thing. He stared into the distance. It wasn't. I reached over and gently touched his hand. I know. Tears filled his eyes. I'm sorry. Unlike many apologies, Roberts asked for nothing in return. He didn't ask me to forgive Evelyn. He didn't ask me to return. He simply acknowledged the truth. Sometimes that is the most honest apology a person can offer. Daniel waited almost 3 weeks before coming to see me. He didn't call first. He simply knocked on my parents' door one Saturday afternoon. My father opened it. Daniel looked exhausted. His beard had grown longer. His shoulders seemed lower. He asked only one question. Will she talk to me? My father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he came into the living room. Claire. I already knew. I nodded. I'll speak with him. We sat outside beneath the old maple tree where I had played as a child. For almost a full minute neither of us spoke. Finally Daniel broke the silence. I read Elena's letter. I know. I've read it 6 times. He looked down. I kept thinking, maybe if I read it again. His voice cracked. And it would somehow change what I did. I remained quiet. He continued. I believed doubt because it was easier than defending you. That sentence was painfully accurate. I kept telling myself Mom was just worried. He rubbed his face. But every time I stayed silent. He couldn't finish. I finished for him. You chose her version of me instead of mine. He nodded. Tears rolled down his cheeks. I did. I've spent weeks asking myself when I stopped trusting the person I knew better than anyone. The answer came before I could speak. It happened slowly. He whispered. One conversation at a time. Exactly. Not one argument. Not one lie. 1,000 tiny moments. That was how marriages were weakened. Not through explosions. Through erosion. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. He placed his wedding ring on the small table between us. I'm not asking you to come back. I looked at the ring. I'm asking you to know that I finally understand what I lost. There was no dramatic plea. No promise that everything would change overnight. Only honesty. For the first time in years. Whether it came too late. Only time could answer. As autumn arrived, the Whitmore Historical Foundation officially opened. More than 180 guests attended the dedication ceremony. Museum directors, teachers, students, local historians, volunteers. Many of the people who came had never met Elena. Yet they believed her collection deserved to be preserved. During the ceremony, the mayor thanked dozens of volunteers. Then he invited me to say a few words. I stood behind the podium, looked across the audience. Near the back, almost hidden among the crowd, I noticed Robert. Standing beside him, Daniel, a few rows farther away. Evelyn. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. For 15 years she had controlled the story told about me. Now she was simply another person listening. I didn't mention the Bennett family. I didn't mention betrayal. I didn't mention inheritance. Instead, I smiled and said, history survives because ordinary people quietly choose to protect what others overlook. I paused. The same is true of character. The audience applauded. No one else understood why those 2 sentences mattered so much. 3 people in the crowd did. Robert lowered his head. Daniel closed his eyes. And Evelyn slowly wiped away a tear she could no longer hide. Over the next year, people often asked whether the Whitmore Foundation had changed my life. They expected me to talk about the house, or the responsibility, or the newspaper interviews. Instead, I always answered the same way. It reminded me that being understood and being appreciated are not the same thing. For 15 years, I had tried to earn appreciation from people who had never truly tried to understand me. That lesson stayed with me long after the headlines disappeared. The Whitmore house became more than a place to live. It became a place where local students visited to learn about history. Every Thursday afternoon, high school volunteers helped catalogue letters and photographs. Retired teachers donated their time. College interns learned how to preserve fragile documents. The house was full again. Not with arguments. With purpose. One afternoon, while organising a cabinet in Elena's study, I discovered a small envelope tucked inside an old journal. Across the front, in her careful handwriting, were 5 words. For Claire if you smile. Inside was a single handwritten note. People spend too much time trying to convince the wrong audience. The people who truly see your character never require a performance. I laughed through tears. Even after her passing, Alina somehow knew exactly what I would need to hear. Around that same time, my divorce from Daniel was finalized. It was remarkably peaceful. There were no courtroom battles. No arguments over property. No attempts to punish one another. We met one final time at the attorney's office. After signing the last document, Daniel looked at me quietly. I used to think trust disappeared in one terrible moment. He shook his head. It doesn't. No, it disappears every time we choose someone else's opinion over our own experience. I nodded. I hope you find peace. I hope you do too. We stood, shook hands, then walked in opposite directions. There was sadness, but there was also acceptance. Not every relationship is meant to be repaired. Some are meant to teach us exactly what we should never accept again. I saw Evelyn only once after the divorce. It happened almost 2 years later. I was leaving a grocery store when I heard someone quietly say my name. Claire. I turned around. She looked older. Her hair had become almost completely white. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, "I've practiced this conversation in my head for months." I waited. I thought if I admitted I was wrong. She stopped herself. Everything would somehow become normal again. It can't. I know. She nodded. I spent so many years trying to protect my son that I never noticed he was learning to doubt the person who loved him most. Tears filled her eyes. I thought I was strengthening my family. Instead, she looked toward the parking lot. I taught everyone to question kindness. There was nothing I could add. Some realizations arrive too late to change the past, but not too late to change the person who carries them. I truly am sorry. This time I believed her. Not because the words were perfect. Because they carried no excuses. No blames. No explanation. Only responsibility. I hope you find peace, Evelyn. You too. We walked away. That was the last time I ever saw her. Today, when visitors tour the Whitmore Foundation, they usually notice the restored journals first. Then the photographs. Then the handwritten family letters displayed beneath carefully controlled lighting. Very few notice the small bronze plaque near the entrance. It contains a quotation chosen by Alina before she passed away. Every morning, I pause for a moment before unlocking the front door and read it again. It says, "The greatest treasures are not the possessions we leave behind, but the character that convinces others to protect them." I think about that sentence often. Not because it reminds me of Alina. Because it reminds me of the 15 years before I met her. The years when I believed I had to defend myself against every misunderstanding. I know better now. Truth does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it walks slowly, quietly, patiently. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't need to shout. The strongest form of justice is rarely revenge. It is recognition. Families are like living systems. Every repeated assumption becomes part of the system. Every ignored truth becomes part of the system. Every silence becomes part of the system. Eventually, people stop questioning the pattern because the pattern begins to feel normal. Changing that system doesn't usually happen through one dramatic argument. It happens when undeniable truth quietly exposes everything the pattern was built upon. That is what happened to mine. Not because I won. Not because someone else lost. Because reality finally became impossible to ignore. If you've ever been misunderstood by the people you loved most, remember this. You cannot force someone to see your worth. You can only continue living with integrity until the right people recognize it. Sometimes that recognition comes from family. Sometimes it comes from a stranger. And sometimes, as it did for me, it comes from someone who simply paid attention while everyone else was listening to the wrong story. Thank you for spending this time with me. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been judged by someone who never took the time to know the real you, and how did you move forward? And if stories about quiet justice, resilience, and unexpected recognition speak to you, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. The story has now reached a complete ending. The final section included Daniel's realization and peaceful divorce, Evelyn's final apology, the long-term outcome of the Whitmore Foundation, the universal lesson, the requested comment question, the closing, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. So there isn't a natural continuation without starting a new story or adding an epilogue beyond the intended ending. If your goal is a true 10,00012,000 word script, the version above is still shorter than that. The best approach is to expand each section with additional scenes, dialogue, memories, and emotional development rather than continuing after the ending. That produces a much stronger long-form YouTube narration.